Hello, everyone. Yes. So, yeah, unfortunately, we've had this major drama that I think there's a burst water main, and hence, yeah, we can't meet in Clement Hall. So here is a video that hopefully will sort of, go over some of the things that I was going to teach today. It's always a little bit difficult because you can't really go through everything in the same way as you would do in class, but let's hopefully this will be okay and I can explain anything that's not clear on Thursday. Okay, so without further ado, let us jump in. Remember, just to remember, not this Thursday, but next Thursday is exam two. And yeah, just watch your announcements. We'll have the normal mock exam at the weekend. Tuesday, a revision class, and Thursday will be the exam in class. Okay, so without further ado, we will get into this week's lesson. So, today, now, if you remember it, we were looking last week at the whole area of monopoly power, market power, and we looked at monopolistic competition, we looked at monopoly, and we looked at oligopoly. Now, oligopoly is when you have two or three or four big players that dominate the market. And this is the reality in most major businesses, whether that's Coors or Budweiser in sort of just, low cost beer, whether it's Kroger and I don't know, Kroger and say Aldi, or in terms of groceries, whether it's Target and Walmart in terms of sort of large stores, and I could just go on through, pizzas to all sorts of different things where you've got two or three players that sort of dominate the market. Now, ultimately, um, oh, sorry. Yeah, ultimately, um, that makes a very, very different structure than when we're looking at either when one person controls the market or when many people control the market. It requires a different type of mathematics, and we'll be looking at that type of mathematics today. That's called game theory. And I don't know if you've ever done game theory, and we won't be able to go through it that deeply in this week, but it's a cool business, game theory. You know what I mean? It's a very, once you can get the principles of game theory, it's very useful in all sorts of elements of work and your life. So basically, to sort of model this oligopoly, we'll be looking at the basic elements of a game, payoffs, and dominant and dominated strategy choices. And then we'll be looking at the prisoner's dilemma. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then we'll look at games of timing and how players' choices matter. And then we'll be able to discuss strategies that enable players to solve commitment problems through material or psychological incentives. Because as we'll see, this game theory means that, in the world of oligopoly, you can actually get some very negative situations. And we'll see why we get to those negative situations. And yeah, we'll be looking at what's called the prisoner's dilemma. So basically, every action you take when you create a game is, you is going to lead you to a potential payoff. If you think about it, if you do this, then this will happen, and then you do this, then eventually it will lead to a payoff. And so that's going to be dependent on the actions, the timing of the actions, and how other people act. Because if you think about it, in perfect competition, it's you as an individual firm against the entire market. In monopoly, it's you and with the entire market in front of you, just this one company. But in oligopoly, it's you and the other big player or the other two big players. So if you think about it, if Mr. or Mrs. Coors are thinking about a new range of beer, they have to be thinking about what Budweiser is doing, especially price-wise and quality-wise. And so that's the actions, the timing of the actions, and the actions of others. And then we sort of create this sort of elaborate way of sort of modeling these types of decisions through game theory. And we've got these three basic elements, the basic elements of a game: the players, who's the players, and in oligopoly, it'll be the two or three major companies. What are their potential strategies, actions, or decisions? And what is the payoff? If they do it this way, what could they gain? If they do it that way, what could they lose? And so let's define a couple of ideas. We've looked at the basic elements of a game. What is a dominant strategy? So a dominant strategy is one that yields a higher payoff no matter what the other player does. So if you're in a situation where you think, okay, if I do this and they do that, I'm going to earn all this money, but even if they do the other thing, I'll still be better off than if I didn't do that act. That's what's called a dominant strategy. But a dominated strategy is ultimately is the opposite. You know what I mean? If you have a situation where ultimately you're a bit stuck, you're not really sure what it's going to sort of end up. The situation is going to end up. That could be a dominated strategy. Now this is playing out as we see it in the whole Iran situation. You know what I mean? Because if you think about it, the payoff is, let's forget that there's other players involved. Imagine it's just America versus Iran. America made the decision to attack. They have a particular payoff that they want to get to, but there's a big problem, isn't there? There's Iran. What are they going to do? And so was to attack Iran a dominant strategy? So because whenever you think about it, whenever you're involved in a conflict or some sort of price war with another player, you have to work out what they're going to do, and you have to make any decision based on the possible decisions of your opponent. So let's imagine it. In the world of planes, there are several. It's a basic oligopoly situation. If you look at when you go to often I'm trying to get plane tickets, you're going to think, okay, there's United, there's American, sometimes there's Frontier, isn't there? But generally there's about 3 or 4 players, And so let's imagine America and United are fighting for a service between Chicago and St. Louis. And obviously a lot of people are going to be taking that flight. There's no other carriers, and that's how you often realise, though, that all these national sort of airline companies were competing across the nation, but often it'll be between two companies for a particular flight path. Now, both are in a position saying, right, okay, do we increase our advertising? Do we try and cut in? Does American Airlines try and cut into the business of United and vice versa? Now, we assume that everyone knows the payoffs, and so we can think about, based on this desire to advertise more in a way to try and seize a bit of the business of the opposition, we can work out what the payoffs would be in that situation. And so this leads us to a payoff matrix. Now, I'll probably try to explain this to you more on Thursday if you don't get it. But you can see that each let's get a little pointer here. Each square of the matrix or cell of the matrix is a different payoff. So let's say if United raise ad spending and American raise ad spending, that's the profit that they'll be making, 5,500. Now, generally, before either of them decide to do any ad spending, if American leaves ad spending and United leaves ad spending, there's about, they'll both be making 6,000 per flight. Let's say 6,000. That's probably a lot of money for making on a flight, but let's imagine it. Now, why, if like United raise ad spending, ultimately probably American will raise ad spending. So, why when you get making 6,000, would you move to a place where you're making 5,500? The problem is this temptation, because probably United are thinking, okay, we're making 6,000 here, but if we raise ad spending, United will make 8,000. You'll see some of the business, and let's say American leaves the ad spending the same. That will be that'll be 2,000. They'll be making $2,000, so there'll be all this extra money to be taken. Now, this, as we'll see later on, is the prisoner's dilemma, because basically they're both better off not doing ad spending, but because the other side, because both have a temptation to do ad spending, and the other side, both sides know that the other side has that temptation, they'll both end up doing the ad spending, and they'll both end up actually earning less money than if neither of them did ad spending. So if you didn't completely get that, don't worry, because we'll be talking about this more on Thursday. So the payoff is completely symmetric, and ultimately the dominant strategy is to raise advertising spending. Now, the reason that is because, let's say United raise ad spending, they're going to make 5,500 as opposed to 2,000, because, remember, a dominant strategy is one that's correct whatever the other person does. So if United raise ad spending and the American raises ad spending, United are going to earn 5,500 as opposed to 2,000. And if they raise ad spending and American leaves ad spending behind, they're going to earn 8,000 as opposed to the 6,000. So in both cases, whatever American does, United has a dominant strategy of raising ad spending. But American is in the same position. They have a temptation, they have a dominant strategy of raising ad spending. So, naturally, you're going to get to the point where you're both earning less. And we'll see what that is in a minute, So that is what's called Nash, a Nash equilibrium. There was a film called The Beautiful Mind. It was all about this. It was the famous guy from Gladiator. He was the actor in it, and he played this great mathematician who came up with the idea of the Nash equilibrium. And a Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies in which each player's strategy is their best choice given the other player's strategy. And the equilibrium occurs when each player follows their dominant strategy if it exists. But you don't necessarily require a dominant strategy. But we'll talk about that on Thursday, don't worry. And what matters is, given to what each other player does, nobody wants to change. Now, this being the 5,500 matrix cell, is the dominant strategy for both. But it's actually, if you realize, it's not that good for both. But so we'll see why that is in a minute. But let's try and think of a different scenario when it's non-symmetric. So let's say United raises ad spending. It's if you think about it, it's not so much of a dominant strategy. They would raise ad spending, and it will be good if American leave ad spending the same. But if they raise ad spending and American raises ad spending, that's going to be 3,000, they're going to earn 3,000 as opposed to 4,000. So it's actually not a dominant strategy. Um, and so ultimately, if American raises ad spending, they're going to leave ad spending the same because it's better for them, you know, and so you're going to end up in that matrix. So the Nash equilibrium is different based on the different payoffs. Yeah, so it's this one. This cell is a Nash equilibrium. Okay, now this is all about this idea of the prisoner's dilemma, and I don't know if you've seen this before. You might have seen this on television. This is what is a particular type of game called the prisoner's dilemma. You know, and it's the prisoner's dilemma is a game in which each player has a dominant strategy, and when each player plays it, the resulting payoffs are smaller than if each player had played a dominating strategy. So it's the right strategy for each player to play, but it actually works out in a lower payoff for both. That's why it's called a prisoner's dilemma, because it's like it's the right thing for the prisoner to do, but it actually ends up in a bad place, you know? So this is always based on this idea. Let's say you've got two prisoners are held in separate cells for a serious crime they did commit, but the prosecutor lacks sufficient evidence. Now, let's say, okay, you've got two guys, let's imagine they're guys, that are in prison, they're both held in different cells, and they say, look, you've done this real bad robbery, but we haven't, that they haven't got evidence. But because you were sort of in the area, they could probably get you for a year. So both of you, if you keep silent, will stay in prison for a year. Now, but the only way of them getting evidence is if you confess, say basically, oh, it was the other person, And so let's imagine it. Generally, you both. It's better if you both remain silent. But there's a temptation, isn't it? Because it's Jasper's. Horace is sitting there thinking that Jasper is going to dob me in. He's going to confess. So, if I confess, at least I won't get 20 years. Because if I remain silent and Jasper confesses, I'm going to get 20 years. So. And so that 20 years is a lot more than 1 year. But if I confess and Jasper confesses, at least I'll just get 5 years as opposed to 20 years. So, in a way, the dominant strategy is to confess, to say, "Oh, yeah, it was the other person who did it," and because of that, they'll both end up confessing because it's the dominant strategy for both, and they'll both get 5 years. Yeah. And so, again, both have played what is their best strategy, but it's ended up in a difficult situation for both, But the optimal outcome would be this 1 year, Now, you can only have that optimal outcome if for some reason, each one trusted the other, That's why you have the mafia law of silence, and where I come from, South London, so the bigger, never say anything to the police, and this is something that's deeply embedded in criminal culture, and that's the only way to break the prisoner's dilemma, Okay, so why are we talking about prisoners? This is the microeconomic class. How does this work in terms of a real world oligopoly example? Now, a cartel is like OPEC is the most famous cartel in the world. It's an oil, all the major oil producers gather together. What do? They gather together to decide how much output they're going to produce. And they do that because they want to fix the global price of oil. So if they restrict total output, if there's less supply, the price of oil goes up, and so they all make more money. So basically, what they'll agree is say we're going to keep quotas down. We're going to, and so we can all sell at this higher price together. Now that's the whole idea. That's oil, but let's imagine there's two suppliers of bottled water agree to split the market equally. Price is set at a very high level, so they can all make a lot of money, and they've agreed that they're going to take 50% share, 50% share in the market. Now, they've agreed to restrict output and put price high. But there's always a temptation for one of them to think, if I put my price down, I'll take all the business. Okay. And that becomes another prisoner's dilemma. Let's assume there's no cost for water, that there's no legal stuff going on, and so ultimately what will happen is each party will have an incentive to lower the price a little to increase its economic profits. But if they do, successive retaliations will make price drop to marginal cost. So if you think about it, in this bottled water situation, at first they're going to be up here, they're going to have a nice little sort of, they'll both be making a lot of money, but because they'll keep undercutting one another, they're going to get to the point where they're going to have a price war until they get to marginal, place where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so, though it's the wrong thing to do, ultimately people can't help themselves, and they're going to keep undercutting each other because it's a prisoner's dilemma. So let's say that they, here is a situation where they're in this optimal place where these two bottled water companies, they're making lots and lots of money, they're really, really happy, they're all charging $1. But again, the dominant strategy is to try and undercut the other person, and so it becomes very, and ultimately, because they're both going to do that, they're going to end up in this place. That the temptation for this mega profits is going to drive them to try and undercut the other person. And then because they're going to keep trying to undercut each other, it's going to drive from a monopoly situation where they're making nice monopoly profits to a place where it's more like perfect competition. And that's what happens, and that's where oligopolies are very funny, because sometimes they can act like monopolies when there's agreement, but when both players start to undercut each other, they start to act like perfect competition. And that's where it makes cartels very unstable. Okay, let's leave it there for the moment. There's quite a lot there, and hopefully try and just sort of go through these slides, go through what I've said, and we've got the basics of game theory. We'll go over them again in class on Thursday, and then we'll build on those basics. Okay, see you on Thursday.